All right, recording has started. So thank you everyone for showing up today to the second ever Portals community call. Today we've got a lot of exciting things to talk about. We've got the all the new goodies from the Wave 1 release notes, the 2020 Wave 1 release notes. So we're going to be going over that. We're going to talk about authentication in Power Apps Portals. And then we'll leave some time for some Q&A as well. So let's dive right into this because I think we got a lot of content for today. So just quick introduction. My name is Nicholas Hayduk. I am the president and a software engineer with Engineered Code Consulting, Inc. I was lucky enough to receive the MVP award last year. And I've been working with what's now known as Power Apps Portals essentially my entire career. I started off with a company that many of you might know called Adxstudio, which is the firm that Microsoft purchased the portals from and has been working on it ever since. So you can see there's a bunch of social media, LinkedIn, Twitter. You can see my blog there, my YouTube channel. I'll also plug this a little bit later on, but I am now, I was invited to be a regular host on the definitive Power Apps Portals podcast known as Refresh the Cache with my co-hosts Colin Vermander and Nick Dolman. So lots of ways that you can get in touch with me. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn if you're not already connected with me. Happy to kind of connect with anyone there and follow my blog and the videos, all that sort of stuff that I'm doing. If you're interested in portals, which I'm assuming you are because you're taking an hour out of your no doubt busy days to hang out with us. So thanks again for being here. I also want to again say thank you to MS Dynamics World. If you were here last month, you'll know that I did a much better job of putting their graphic on the screen this time. They helped me out by providing me with the GoToWebinar and help me get the word out. And so Jason and his team over there at MS Dynamics World, thank you for everything you do to support me. It was really kind of out of the blue. I just said, hey, I'm thinking about doing these community calls. Do you want to help? And they've done everything I've asked of them. So it's been very, very helpful. So. So in terms of our agenda, as I mentioned, what we'll be talking about today is the news that has come out, recent news with regards to portals, which specifically is the 2020 Wave 1 release notes or the release plan. So lots of stuff to talk about in there. We will talk about Power Apps Portals authentication. We'll then have time for Q&A, and then we'll talk about the time of the next call for the Portals community call. So, all right, let's dive right into the fun of the portal news. So, as I mentioned, I believe right there at the end of January, Microsoft released the 2020 release Wave 1 plans, which included a whole bunch of new goodies that we can expect to see here over the next few months. I think technically the way this works is they used to be called kind of the April release notes. So it's all these features we can hopefully expect to see sometime between April and October, knowing that the Wave 2 kind of starts in October. So anything they've announced here, the plan is that we'll see something in the next kind of in the 6-month time frame between April and October. What I found, one thing that I found interesting is which release plans the Power Apps Portals notes were in. So Microsoft has different release notes, whether they are for Power Platform versus Dynamics. And if you look through the Dynamics release plan, you will not see really any mention of portals. I think I did a search for the word portal, and the only one I found had to do with F&O stuff. All of the things that I'm talking about today are in the Power Platform release plans, which truly emphasizes the fact that the portal is really a part of the Power Platform now. It's not really, there's no dependency on Dynamics anymore. It obviously worked very well with Dynamics, but the dependency on Dynamics has been removed, and Power Apps Portal really is, one of the 3 main types of apps alongside Canvas and model driven. So I found that kind of interesting that all of the things that we saw related to Power Apps portals are in the Power Platform release notes. So now let's get to the actual fun features, and I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. If you're looking for more details on this, I'd recommend we did a podcast earlier this week, and it was released, I believe, yesterday on Refresh the Cache, going into these in quite a bit more detail. So I believe it was, close 45 minutes, 50 minutes, something like that. So if you're interested in more details, definitely check out the podcast. But just kind of at a high level here, the first thing that struck me as I looked at the release notes was the fact that, or the emphasis that Microsoft is putting into what they call the Power Apps Portal Studio. So the Power Apps Portal Studio is what they call kind of the new editor that they've been working on. It looks kind of like editing a Canvas app. It's kind of drag and drop. It's the new content management interface that they've been working on. They've kind of given it a name now, and it's called Power Apps Portal Studio. And many of the items that have been mentioned in the release plans are all feature enhancements to the Portal Studio. Now, what's interesting here is none of the things that you see in that list of enhancements to the Portal Studios are new features per se for portals. What they are is they've added those capabilities just to the studio. So the first one on the list there, you'll see Power BI. So currently, if you want to embed a Power BI report or dashboard on your portal, you have to use Liquid. You basically find the Liquid tag, you put in a bunch of parameters, and you drop it on the page. What they're introducing to the Power Apps Portal Studio is the ability to kind of drag and drop, and a more GUI, more developer or more citizen developer friendly way of doing that. So again, they haven't added any new features to the Power BI integration. What they've done is they've made it easier for people to remove the requirement to know how to use Liquid in order to add the Power BI charts to your portal. With the simplified theming, they didn't really give us a whole lot of details on what they mean by simplified theming. But again, right now, if you know how to use Bootstrap, if you know how to use custom CSS, you can do your own custom theming. So this new custom theming isn't new for the portals, it's new for the Portal Studio. The permissions management, it appears like they're going to give us the ability to manage web roles and entity permissions within the Portal Studio. So again, that can be done with a model-driven app today, but we're moving into the more citizen developer-friendly studio. And then with the identity providers, and it kind of ties in nicely to what we're talking today with authentication, we'll go over the fact that you have to go in and you have to configure these site settings, and there's these kind of settings with these names that you kind of have to know, where you go to the documentation and you got to make sure you're kind of copying and pasting things right. There's really no validation that things are set up properly. It kind of, if it doesn't work, you're kind of guessing as to why this isn't working. So what they're looking to do is add the setup of identity providers. They're looking to simplify that and not make it just site settings, but having a nice interface to kind of step you through the process of having identity providers configured in your Power Apps portal. So again, what's interesting here is they're putting a lot of their effort into making the Power Apps portals more citizen developer friendly, as opposed to adding net new features. So it's kind of, you can see the writing on the wall. What they're really trying to do is making this a citizen developer platform. So that being said, the next thing on this list is what I'm really excited about, which is a CRUD web API. Now, we don't really know the details of what this API is going to look like, but essentially what they're going to give us is some sort of API so that we can perform CRUD meaning create, read, update, and delete operations against CDS data. So right now on a portal, our only real options for editing data is using entity forms, entity lists, or web forms, which are great, but they kind of constrain you to a specific UI. Now, with Power Apps, or with this CRUD API, what we kind of guess is that we're going to either, whether it's in Liquid, I kind of feel like it's going to be in JavaScript. They're going to give us an API endpoint where we can make authenticated, secured requests and do things like create records, edit records, delete records, that sort of thing through the API, which I suspect will probably be protected using the entity permissions that we all know and some love, I guess. So from a developer standpoint, I kind of mentioned that, hey, they're putting a lot of investment into making it citizen developer friendly. CRUD API, that is the complete opposite of citizen developer. That is 100% developer. So it's really exciting to see that it's not like they're not doing anything for us people who are probably more developer inclined. That's a huge feature, and what it's going to do is it's going to remove the need to do a lot of what we call companion apps. Whereas in the past, companion apps, we would need them to interact with CDS data or other data. Now, if you're just interacting with CDS data, the CRUD API will hopefully give us what we need to do. Doesn't eliminate the need for companion apps, because if you're dealing with third-party APIs, it's still probably the way to go. But for just interacting with CDS data, that CRUD API is probably going to be a real lifesaver and really simplify a lot of projects that we're working on. This next one on the list was actually the one that kind of surprised me. I didn't really see it coming. It's something that I hadn't really kind of thought about. But when I saw it, I kind of looked back to a few projects we worked on where it would have been really helpful. And that is the ability to add additional entities to the search functionality. So right now you can when you search, you can search through cases and knowledge base and web pages and web files. There's a certain list of entities that will be included when you do a search on your portal. What Microsoft has said in their plans is that they're going to allow you to configure that for pretty much any entity that you want. So if you've created custom entities and you want to make them available via that search, that's now going to be possible. So that's really cool. I'm really excited, and I've got a few projects that we're working on right now that are going to leverage that. So I'm excited to see that. Again, it was a little bit surprising. I hadn't really been on my radar. So it's cool to kind of see those features pop up that you weren't really even expecting. They've also announced that kind of as expected, they're going to continue to enhance the portal checker. If you haven't used the portal checker before, it's a tool that you can run on your portal instance in the administration area that will kind of run a diagnostic check on your portal. We'll look for kind of known issues, common misconfigurations, that sort of thing, and give you a report back on how you might be able to fix it. So it's really a never-ending job for Microsoft to keep this up to date. So as expected, pretty much every release cycle they say, hey, we're going to continue to add more rules to our portals checker. So that doesn't really come to as much of a surprise. The last one here on the list is, this one's quite technical, and we're kind of guessing it might be related to the CRUD API, but they're adding the authorization code flow for OpenID Connect. Right now, I believe it only supports the implicit grant flow, but I believe they're adding support for authorization code. So that kind of covers the high-level highlights that of the news that is specific to Power Apps portals. However, there's one other thing that wasn't in the Power Apps portals section that has been recently announced that may have a big impact on a lot of people working with portals and Dynamics or the Power Platform. And that is something known as WS Trust and the organization service proxies. Those are both being deprecated. Oh, that's wrong. It's not as of 2020. So that should have been as of April 2022. So yeah, don't be totally, it's not next month, it's not in 2 months, it's April 2022. And why does this matter why am I talking about this on a portals portals call? Because this could effectively mean the end of Adxstudio and the open source version known as XRM Portals Community Edition. The open source version and Adxstudio rely on WS Trust authentication. They rely on the organization service proxy. And so as of April 2022, when Microsoft turns off the support for those, right as it stands right now, the portal will stop functioning. Now, I know that there's talk, and again, we dive into this extensively on the podcast. There's talk about, it may be possible to update the code, but it's not a small undertaking. So, whether someone decides to go out and do that and update the portal, the XRM Portals Community Edition open source, that there is a kind of a ticket logging that, but no one I know yet has kind of stepped in and said for sure we're going to do that. So the kind of the ticking time bomb that we knew that open source code was always going to be, we may know when that time bomb may go off, and that's as of April 2022. So again, if you are still using, I've heard rumors that people are still using Adxstudio version 5 and 6. If you're using any sort of Adxstudio version or the XRM Portals Community Edition, consider this your latest wake-up call that the first wake-up call should have been when Microsoft were not supporting this anymore. This is your next wake-up call to say, hey, you really need to think about what you're going to be doing with your Adxstudio or XRM Portals Community Edition, because it's the writing's on the wall, and soon it won't work unless someone puts in a lot of work. So so those were the two big topics of news this past month, the release notes and the fact that this deprecation is happening. And I know that there are still a lot of customers using these technologies. So just definitely be aware. All right, so that kind of covers the news. Let's talk about today's topic, which is authentication in Power Apps portals. So authentication in Power Apps portals is currently configured using site settings. And so when we talk about authentication, what we're talking about is how do your users sign into the portal. We know that when you sign into CDS, you're using Azure Active Directory. However, when you sign into a portal, you have a multitude of options as to how you can actually log in to your portal. I would broadly group the options into two main categories. And so one is local authentication, and the other one being external authentication. Now, local authentication is when the username and the hashed passwords are stored directly in CDS. So if you're using local authentication, there is a username field, there is a field in CDS that stores the hash password, and those are stored directly on the contact record in CDS. This is a very popular method because it's very easy. It basically comes built in, doesn't really require any setup. Like I said, very popular, used a lot. The problem with this method is that it has been deprecated. Now, the notice of deprecations, I think, has disappeared, but last time I asked the Microsoft product team, they still say that it's deprecated, and they would really prefer that you didn't use the local authentication. And we do suspect at some point it will go away. We don't know when it will go away, but on any projects going forward, we strongly recommend that you look at not leveraging local authentication for your portal. So we'd strongly suggest looking at a method of external authentication. And when we say external authentication, what we mean is that the portal itself doesn't handle authentication. It delegates that to another party. So it relies on a third party, and all the portal does is it stores the identifier that the third party has given it, and it trusts that if the identifier says, or if that third party says, yes, this person is who they say they are, then they trust that third party. What's great about this from a portal's perspective is that the portal never sees the user's password. So there's really not, you don't have to be worried about password leaks or anything like that. The portal is not responsible for dealing with passwords. So that's probably one of the reasons why the Power Apps Portals team wants to kind of get rid of local authentication and kind of push the burden of passwords and usernames off to someone else and only have to worry about relying on one of those providers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dive a little bit more into the authentication of the external authentication, because there are, as you can see from this list, there are four main types of external authentication. And what these are is they're essentially different authentication protocols that Power Apps Portal supports. So you can see from the list here that the protocols are OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, SAML 2.0, and WS Federation. So many of the popular authentication mechanisms out there, you know, Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, Google, LinkedIn, Yahoo, some of them will support multiple of these protocols. And if you look at like an actual, you know, identity provider like Azure Active Directory, which is meant for authentication, it would possibly support multiple of these. So in theory, you could support, say, Azure Active Directory using OAuth 2 and OpenID and WS Federation and SAML. You know, that's kind of, it is impossible, or it is in theory possible. So really what you're looking at is you need to identify how you want users to log in to your portal, determine which protocols that method supports, and see, and hopefully it matches up with one of the protocols that I've mentioned in this list. Now, in that list, OpenID Connect is you know, becoming probably the most popular protocol. So anything that's kind of recent would most likely support something like OpenID Connect. And the great thing about the OpenID Connect is that it will support anything that is OpenID Connect compliant. That is not to say that is not true for OAuth 2. You can see from my slide here that for OAuth 2, there is a specific list of providers that Portal supports. So they support Microsoft, Twitter, Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, and Yahoo. If you have any other OAuth 2 compliant provider, it won't work with Portals. You can only configure the ones that are on that list. Whereas these other options, OpenID Connect, SAML, and WS Federation, it's a little bit more broad. So as long as you find an identity provider that supports those protocols, you can configure your portal to use those. Like I said, OpenID Connect is probably the one that I see using the most often. And in fact, it's relatively simple to build your own OpenID Connect provider. So when I have customers come to me and ask, hey, we've got this kind of internal identity management system that we've kind of built from scratch, can I make that work with portals? And the answer is just make that provider OpenID Connect compliant, and then yes, it will work. So that, like I said, that's kind of, I don't know if it's the standard, but it's, you know, what we see as kind of the most popular protocol for integrating authentication and integrating identity providers with portals. So let's talk about Azure AD B2C, because when Microsoft said back in the day that they don't want people using local authentication, they also said we want people using Azure AD B2C. Now you'll notice that Azure AD B2C wasn't on the previous list, and that's because Portals itself doesn't have any specific, you know, there's nothing built into Portals that relies specifically on Azure AD B2C. Instead, Azure AD B2C is OpenID Connect compliant. So all you have to do is you can go through the documentation, but you'll see that you're configuring just like you could configure any other OpenID Connect provider. That is how you configure Azure AD B2C. Now, I will kind of switch to showing some actual kind of how it gets set up a little bit here, but just know that there's two really great resources on kind of stepping you through how you would set up Azure AD B2C for your portal. It is pretty straightforward. It's about 3 site settings that you configure. Again, I'll show you. Yeah, there's a couple of great resources. One of them, the Ready XRM blog by Nick Dolman, basically step-by-step screenshots of how to set it up. So what's interesting, if you're not familiar with Azure AD B2C, the thing to know about it is it's you know, unrelated to Azure AD. It's not Azure Active Directory, so you're not logging in with your corporate Azure Active Directory accounts. What it is, it's a separate service, the B2C standing for business to consumer, that lets you configure additional identity providers for your users to log in with. So using Azure AD B2C, you can allow your users to log in with Facebook or Twitter or Microsoft accounts or Yahoo, all those kind of providers that we talked about. So it's kind of it is in itself an identity provider, but it's an identity provider that can rely on other identity providers as well. So when you're kind of designing your authentication scheme for your portal, there's kind of all these different layers that you could implement. So let's say, for example, you wanted 2 OpenID Connect options, because the thing with portals is that you don't have to pick one provider. You can pick as many providers as you want for identity. So let's just say you wanted to pick you had 2 different OpenID Connect providers that you want to add to your portal. You could choose to put both of those directly into your portal and configure them that way. So then right on your portal interface, you'd get 2 buttons on your portal that pick between the authentication providers. Or you could leverage Azure AD B2C, which would be your single identity provider for your portal, and then configure Azure AD B2C to have those 2 OpenID Connect providers within there. So by delegating all of that to Azure Active Directory B2C, you kind of take the dependency outside of portals and you put it on Azure AD B2C. You then just on your portal, you just configure Azure AD B2C, and then the rest of the configuration of your identity providers is all done in the Azure AD B2C interface, which is done through the Azure portal. So I'm going to just flip here to my actual thing here. I'm going to maybe go back a slide here. So I'm going to just show you kind of how this actually kind of works in the real world. So if I were to bring up this, so I'm going to go into here, bring up this. All right. So I'm just bringing up the portal that I've spun up here for today's session. This is just a basic starter portal, literally just set up, and the only thing I've done is I've actually configured Azure AD B2C for this portal. So I am signed in already. I'm going to sign out, and when I go back to sign in, what you're going to see is that I've got my different options here. So here is the local authentication that I had talked about. And here is the list of all the external identity providers that I have configured. That could be 0. That could be, like I said, it's really kind of unlimited to how many different providers you have here. So when you spin up a starter portal, it will be configured to allow local sign-in, and it will also be configured with Azure AD. And what that allows you to do is you can log in with the account that you use to set up your portal, which is of course with Azure Active Directory. So if you click on that and you log in, you'll automatically be an administrator. So when I spun up this portal, I didn't have to create a contact. I didn't have to do anything. I just clicked on Azure AD. It signs me in. It kicks me over to my Azure Active Directory login, signs me in, and now I'm logged in using the credentials that I used to set up my portal. So that's why every portal comes set up by default with Azure Active Directory, configured as an identity provider, but it's something that you can turn off very easily with a single site setting. And I see I do have some questions here. I'll jump to those in just a second. While we wait for this to spin over there, I just want to kind of point out, so this is the post from Nick Dolman on configuring Power Apps, the Azure Active Directory. And you can see that it's basically just kind of screenshot after screenshot. It probably looks a little bit more intimidating than it actually is. It's something you can do. Once you've done it once, it's something you can do in about 10 minutes. I'm just waiting for my portal to load here. So you can see I've logged in here using my Azure Active Directory. Now, again, if I sign out, if I go back to my sign in, I could potentially sign in with my local sign in, or as I've mentioned, I've configured my Azure Active Directory B2C. Now I will show you the settings that required. And the good news is that it's actually pretty straightforward. In order to configure a basic implementation of Azure AD B2C, it really only requires 3 settings. You have to provide the authority, the client ID, and the redirect URI. Now, again, I'll kind of leave it to the documentation to show you how you can kind of set that up and get those values. But it's pretty straightforward. That being said, this is the experience that Microsoft is looking to improve upon as they've announced in their release plans. Because you do have to kind of jump between portals and you have to kind of get different values and you have to, click a few things to say get this particular value. That's the process that Microsoft is trying to streamline. So they're going to take a process that if you've done it once, you can do it in 10 minutes, but they want it the first time you do it to take 10 minutes. And that's what they're planning on doing with that, with their, in the new plan. So I am just going to hop over to my Azure portal. So within your Azure portal, the thing that's kind of interesting about Azure AD B2C is that it's not located in the same, it's an Azure service, but it's not located in the same tenant as your regular Azure Active Directory. So when you go to create one, it actually creates a new environment for a new tenant in Azure for this. So it is a separate area with its own kind of set of resources. So once you kind of set this up, and again, those documents will kind of show you how to do that, you can go into Azure Active Directory B2C, and in here you'll see, for example, if I go into identity providers, I can see the list of identity providers that they kind of support right out of the box. And so what we mean by out of the box is you kind of go in there, you put in your few settings, and those identity providers will become configured right away. You'll also see that it supports a generic OpenID Connect provider, as well as you'll see that it supports local accounts. So a local account is very similar to what I kind of described in your Power Apps portals as a local account, but in this case, it's local to your Azure Active Directory B2C instance. So the username and password is specific to this B2C instance, so it's not using something like Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn to log in. So users are able to create their own unique usernames and passwords, but again, it's not the portal's job to manage those. Azure Active Directory B2C is handling that for you. So even in cases where you don't want people to be logging in with their social identities, Azure AD B2C is still very much an option. People often think, okay, if I'm not using Twitter, I just want people to create their own usernames and passwords. Why would I use Azure AD B2C? Because eventually local authentication with portals will be gone. So I'd recommend you start from here. So again, so here's the list where you can kind of configure. You can see that in this case, I've configured an OpenID Connect. What I did this for was actually a proof of concept for another project where I was using Azure Active Directory which is an OpenID Connect provider itself, to log into my portal. So in addition to logging in with other identities, you can also log in to Azure Active Directory through Azure AD B2C. So pretty much anything that's OpenID Connect compliant, and then these ones on the list here. So that's all kind of configured in there. The other kind of great thing about Azure AD B2C is that, here, let me just flip over to here. I'm going to click the sign in link, and you'll see if I've configured this properly. Oh, yeah, because I've got Azure Active Directory turned on. User flows, identity providers. I'm going to remove that. And I'm going to go to my user flow. So on a user flow basis, I'm able to select which identity providers I want to use. Let me see if I can get that to work a little bit better. So when you click the B2C link, you'll be taken to a page hosted by Azure AD B2C where you actually perform your login. So if you had configured, a number of different identity providers, okay, it's not going to like that. So what you get is a sign-in page on Azure AD B2C. And out of the box, it's kind of branded as you'd expect, kind of Microsoft Azure, but you can go in and configure those pages. And in fact, there's documentation specifically on how to brand those to match the look and feel of your portal. So users, other than seeing that the URL has changed, you can make the sign-in page for Azure AD B2C look very much like your portal. And that's done in your user flows. And you go into here. And then what you can do is you can say page layouts. And you can go into here and you can configure custom pages. And you can actually pull data directly from your portal and actually display pages from your portal and integrate those into your sign-in experience. So you can see here that you can customize the sign-in or sign-up page, the local account sign-up page, as well as the error page. So those are some of the pages that you can configure because, again, when you're logging into Azure AD B2C, all of that is hosted by Azure AD B2C and not your portal. Another interesting thing are application claims. So application claims are details about the user that you can include when someone signs in. So for example, with Azure Active Directory, one of the claims is what their email address is. And you can actually pass that to the portal so that when someone logs into your portal for the first time, it can then extract the information from those claims and use that to pre-populate your contact record. So, commonly that would be used for, say, first and last name. So if your identity provider, in this case, if you're using Azure AD B2C, if you have the claims in there, and again, claims are just information that's contained in the token that's passed back to the portal. If there's information in those claims that you want to map back to the to your contact in CDS, that is completely possible. You can basically map them to say the claim, which has a name of this, should get set to the field over in CDS named this. So again, you'll see that commonly for first and last name, job title, email address, phone numbers, whatever claims are being provided by your identity providers can be mapped to your contacts in CDS. Okay, I'm just going to pause here because I do see I have a question here about this. So someone is asking, how do we implement single sign-on? And they've got Azure AD in brackets. So if you're using Azure Active Directory, so you pretty much will always have to click the sign on button. There's really no way to, like, if you get to your portal and you still need to click sign in. Now, if you've integrated, say, with Azure Active Directory, what you can do is if you pick a single identity provider, so in this case, again, we've got kind of three identity providers. We've got local, Azure AD, and Azure AD B2C. If we were to pick a single one, we can make it so that when you click sign in, it doesn't go to this page, but goes immediately to our identity provider. If I jump over to the documentation, do I have that open still? Nope, doesn't look like I have that open. So there's basically a site setting where you can say, here is the one and only identity provider that I want you to consider for my portal. Then when you click the sign in link, it will get redirected to your identity provider sign-in page. Now, if that's something like Azure Active Directory, and so you'll see here, pretend like when I click on Azure AD, that's like what happens when I click my sign-in link. So if I do that, you'll see that it just essentially is single signing me on because I've already signed in with Azure Active Directory. I didn't have to put in my username or password or anything like that. So I don't think you can really avoid forcing users to click the sign in. But when they click the sign in, they're not going to get asked for their username and password again, assuming they've already authenticated with the central provider. And then the next question here is, if using Active Directory, how can we prevent users from logging into the portal? So the way that you can do that is whether you have what's called open registration or not. So open registration means that when someone, if I were to sign out here, I go to sign in. So you'll see that there's a register option here, so I can register with a new account. There's a site setting where you can turn off open registration, and what that means is that in order to sign in, you must already have a contact record in Dynamics. That would eliminate the ability for someone, even if they've got an appropriate Active Directory account, they still won't be able to get into your portal. If you do that, then you have to rely on using things like invitation codes to get people to register. Even if you disable open registrations, people can still accept invitation codes, and that's actually what I'll be talking about next year is invitation codes. Yeah, that's how you would kind of stop them, is you'd have to turn off open registration. I see another question here. Can we map claims from OpenID Connect to web roles? So I'm assuming what you're asking there is if there's a claim, if there's information in your claim that you could use to determine which web roles a person should be able to get. And the answer is yes, but it takes a little bit of work. You could use something like Flow to do that. Essentially, the limitation there is that your mappings have to be to attributes on the contact record. So what I would recommend in that case is you would create a custom attribute that would essentially, call it web roles or something like that, that you would then map that the claim to that attribute, and then use either classic workflows or Power Automate to then read that field and then do the necessary association for web roles. So it is possible, but not quite, you can't quite do that because you have to map them to attributes on the contact record, not kind of related records like web roles. So it's a little bit of extra work. And then I see, where is the sign-in page hosted? Is it possible to have the page created on the Power Up portal as I need to style the page using CSS? So again, the sign-in page again depends on whether you're using Azure AD B2C or another identity provider. The sign-in page here is hosted on the portal. Whenever you click one of these external links, these external identity providers, the sign-in page is wherever they are. So in the case of Azure AD B2C, they host the sign-in page. Now, most of those identity providers will give you the option to customize those pages so that it fits in with your site, so that it looks and feels like your site. And that's what I was mentioning about Azure AD B2C. They definitely allow you to do that, including the documentation that Microsoft has in order to the documentation to show you how to do that specifically for portals. I'm just going to find that here just to kind of show you what I'm talking about. 1 second, Azure B2C. Here we go. So if I bring up this documentation, so you'll see that here so this is the portal configuration where you can essentially set up your site settings. Then they talk about customizing the Azure AD B2C user interface. So this is where they say you can actually set up a page in your portal. So this is a page you'd set up using a web template. And then you can have Azure AD B2C make a call to your portal to pull down this template to use as kind of the framework. And so that way you can leverage as much as possible of the existing custom CSS on your portal. Or you can just completely customize it in Azure AD B2C. There's a few different options there. And then with regards to, here's the documentation on the claims mappings, where again, you have this site setting where you then map from attribute or from claim to attribute. So you can see here, for example, the claim job title is getting mapped to the job title claim on the contact record in CDS. So I hope that answers those questions. I'm going to just flip back here to my presentation because I did want to talk about invitation codes. All right. So there's, as I kind of alluded to earlier, your options for having people get into your portal is you either have open registration enabled, which means that anyone who can authenticate into your external providers can log in, or you allow them to create their own username and password through the local authentication, or you disable that and you can use invitation codes. The other very strong use case for invocation codes are when you are creating a portal for an existing, CDS or Dynamics instance where there are many, there could be hundreds, thousands of contacts that already exist. When you go through the process of open registration, as a general rule, that will create a new contact for you. Now, there is functionality to do perhaps some claim mapping. So if the user logs in and their claim includes their email address, you can attempt to automatically associate users with existing contacts. But in general, if that doesn't match up, the user will get it will create a new contact record for them. Again, if you have thousands of existing contacts, you don't want those duplicates. You want, when they log in, you want them to be associated to you want them to be linked with their contact record. So in order to do that, what you use is the invitation code model, which is essentially you send them an email with a unique key. They then can register using that unique key, and then when they go to set up their account, instead of creating a brand new contact, it will use the one that's associated with that key. Just a few things to know about the invitation code model. It can also be used to give existing users additional web roles. I don't see that used very often, but the reason I mention it is that there's the idea of a group invitation. So people think that when I have 1,000 users that I want to invite to my portal, or 1,000 contacts, they'll just send out a single invitation using the ability to send out the group invitation. But the group invitation is really meant for allowing existing users to get additional web roles. Because if you use the group invitation, everyone gets the exact same invitation code, which, as you can imagine, isn't really that helpful for figuring out which contact has clicked on the link. So if you're going to invite thousands of users and you want them to all get to be associated to their individual contact, you have to generate invitation codes unique for each one of those people. So just be aware that the group invitation is meant for adding more web roles to existing contacts and not meant for the initial blast that you might have at the beginning saying, hey, 1,000 people who already have contacts, here's the link to register for our new portal. The other thing to know about it is that it does rely on the classic workflows, not Power Automate. So when invitation codes are going out, it's using workflows to send out those emails. So you need to make sure you've got emails sending configured properly with server-to-server emailing, the server-based emailing. And then those emails contain text, and I would argue that it's not the most pleasant, pleasant sounding. It's it's just generic text. So strongly recommend that you look at those workflows if you're going to use the process and customize the text in there. You can brand it, put your own colors, all that sort of stuff in there. So just be aware that when you're using the invitation codes, it is relying on those classic workflows, and those are customizable to make it a little bit more personal and on brand. So that's what I had to cover for authentication here. I think I got one more. I got another question here. So possible to have invitation code plus Azure Active Directory external login. Yeah, the invitation code isn't really tied to the specific identity provider. When you go to accept the invitation code, you essentially get to click on whichever of the providers that you want that are configured. So if you had Azure Active Directory as a provider, you could accept invitation codes using that way. Don't know if I've ever actually done that myself, but I'm not aware that should work as far as I know. Any tips for changing the portal URL on the invitation when you deploy the solution from dev to QA to prod? Yeah, that one's not so fun. I don't have anything other than the same techniques you'd be using, nothing portal specific. So the challenge there is that the URL that you put in, there's essentially a hard-coded URL in the workflow that sends out the invitation code. Of course, that invitation code needs to be a link to your portal. If you have a dev and a QA and a prod portal, those will have different URLs. So what we've typically done is use something like a site setting or something, and then pull in that value dynamically into the workflow, rather than hard coding the link into the setting. So into the workflow. So we'll use whether it's site settings or a custom setting entity where there's a key value pair. You can then reference that record in your workflow and use the value that's in there as opposed to hard coded in the template. So that's typically what we've done in the past. If anyone's got any other questions, we've got another about 8 minutes here. They do not have to be authentication related if anyone else has any other questions as well. So we'll hang out here. I got a question here. It says, is it possible now to use Power Automate with Portal, for instance, on the click of a button, then it trigger a flow? So short answer is no. Like there's nothing, they haven't kind of done that out of the box. There's some, I would call them unrecommended workarounds. I know Nick Dolman's got a post out that he fully admits that it's just more of an interesting proof of concept because it's not very secure. So there is no kind of built-in. They haven't kind of added the ability like we kind of are waiting for them to do. That hasn't changed. It says, can there be multiple Azure AD tenants to sign in with? For example, a B2B scenario with multiple different customers, each in their own AD. So with Azure Active Directory, and that's one of the reasons we did the proof of concept, with Azure Active Directory, you can enable it to be multi-tenant, which means that anyone with a valid Azure Active Directory account can log in. Now, there's a few different ways that you can do it. So the good thing about that is that you don't have to configure every end customer's specific Azure Active Directory tenant in your thing. So let's say you're working with company A's and company B and company C, you don't have to go out and specifically federate with company A, B, and C. You can just say anyone who has a valid Azure Active Directory account can log into my portal. And that's one of the settings that exists on Azure Active Directory. Let me see if I can just kind of show that to you. So if I go into my Azure Active Directory and I go into my properties, actually, no, it wouldn't be in here. Let me switch over to identity providers. No, it won't be in here. It'll actually be in a different screen. Let me just swap over to Azure Active Directory. And if we go into app registrations, when you create your app registration, you actually have the option to say the supported account types. So you can see here it's accounts in any organizational directory. So that's what I've done here in this particular case. So you can do that, but again, then it's anyone who has one of those accounts. You can also, in Azure AD B2C, you could, if you want to limit it to say only company A, B, and C, you could add each one of their companies as OpenID Connect providers to your Azure AD B2C. Or you could also, if you want to do it directly on a portal, add addition, set up each one of their Azure AD B2C as a separate identity provider. The problem with that is that they each get their own link and they have to kind of click on the right link to do it. So kind of yes, but probably not the answer you were hoping for. Got a question here, not related to authentication. Is there any way to see the numbers of logins, passes consumed remaining? I believe the answer to that is still no. We all know that that's how Microsoft is charging for Power Apps portals. But as far as I know, I haven't seen the interface yet that tells you how many a particular customer is consuming. So I believe they are still working on that. Okay. So I'll hang out here if people got more questions. I did want to talk about the next call. The next call is scheduled for March 26th, 2020 at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So if you are, if you've got any value out of this and want to kind of keep hanging out with us once a month, that's the next call. I know some of you probably have registered directly through MS Dynamics World. If you kind of want to keep up with all the latest stuff, there is a web page on our Engineered Codes website where people can register for the to kind of receive updates. Essentially, it goes on a mailing list where I send out essentially once a month saying, here's the recording from the last month, here's the link to the next month, any sort of updates, that sort of thing. I don't intend on spamming people for any other purposes other than kind of once a month. Here's the link to sign up, and here's the recording from last month. So if you want to do that, you can do that, or just watch out for the notices on my Twitter, LinkedIn. I put it out on there, or the folks at MS Dynamics Worlds do a great job of promoting it as well. So next call will be the 26th. And again, just thank you to the folks at MS Dynamics World. Yeah, I'll hang out here for another couple minutes if people have any questions. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending, and we'll hopefully see you next month. Just another thing to mention while people are kind of dropping off here, if you do have any topics, I haven't picked what the topic is going to be next month. So if anyone has any specific requests, I know it's something that people can submit as part of the registration on our site. But yeah, if anyone has any requests, you can put it in the questions there, or email it to me, reach out to me on LinkedIn, because kind of take it on a month by month basis. I look at what people are kind of interested in, and like I said, I haven't really decided on yet what we're going to do next month. So if people are interested in a specific topic, let me know, and we'll see what we can do. All right, well, I think I'm just going to end the recording. I don't see any other questions here. So thanks again for attending, and hope to see you next month.